So I'm going to read, just thought it would be good practice really, just to read something from the Bible, just to center us, remind us the ultimate source of what this is all about, because it's easy to get a bit abstracted from that when we start talking about church sometimes. This is from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. You'll know it very well, but perhaps listen to it prayerfully and reflectively. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them up, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So, if you read the excerpt, you'll recognise that I sort of focus the reflections on time and on busyness and on the acceleration of time. And I thought what I wanted to do just briefly is do a broad brush overview of sort of the different ages of Western culture, which sounds like a bit of a ambitious thing to do in 10 minutes, but it will land us hopefully on some helpful, I think, reflections on time and how that relates to church. And in this slide, you'll see you've got what people generally recognize as the three main ages of Western culture: pre-modern, modern, and post or late modern. And then the table has on the left-hand side a number of sort of themes of culture and how those are expressed in these different ages. So it starts with authority, and where in the pre-modern, so that's sort of, prior to the Enlightenment, the height of Christendom, certainly the first millennia and a bit more since Christ. Authority it is developed through very inherited fixed structures, um, very hierarchical, and then moves into a modern era where there's the rise of more institutional authority, governments and third sector organizations. And we live, I would argue, in an era where people are pretty skeptical about authority and are finding authority in all sorts of places, like amongst influencers. And we've got, things like Donald Trump, who emerges, through a democratic process and yet feeds on a fairly anti-authoritarian skepticism. So in terms of authority, we're in a very strange and paradoxical place. And then the form of community in the sort of pre-modern age, you've got the feudal estates, a very land-based hierarchical understanding of community. And then in the modern era moves into a more urban neighborhood or factory or office, sort of solidarity around place, but particularly around the city and around work. And in the post or late modern era, you see the emergence of communal forms based around sort of pastimes and affiliations, networks facilitated by social media. And then beginning then to think about spirituality. In the pre-modern age, the spirituality is an integration of the sacred and secular, what philosopher called Charles Taylor called an enchanted world. Everything material is connected in some way with the spiritual realm, and it's felt to be so. And it's people live as if this were so. And then in the modern, an increased division between the sacred and secular. to the point where the spiritual is increasingly, shut out from from day-to-day life. And so, we live increasingly in what Charles Taylor calls an immanent frame. So like that life carries on, and our culture is essentially living as if there were no transcendence beyond, to nothing beyond what we can see or experience. And yet, he says, in the postmodern and late modern stage, spirituality and religion hasn't gone away, but it's changed. It's been reframed around an individual or authentic quest. People are searching for the spiritual, but very much searching individually and in all sorts of different ways, not necessarily connecting with institutional religion, but finding their own way to express the spirituality as they see is authentic to themselves. And then in terms of time, in the pre-modern era, time was seen as sacred. I mean, we lived in a sense of living in God's time. So the seasonal and the circular were very important to people, in a sense that time was very integrated with every aspect of life. Whereas in the modern age, time increasingly becomes something that's quantified and measured, and then and then began to be used for the purposes of industry and capitalism. So it becomes very linear, becomes very utilitarian. And some people would argue that in the post or late modern era that we're sort of living in the ultimate effects of that modernist approach to time, where time is accelerating so fast that we're increasingly alienated from the world that we live in, because we've almost like disconnected time from its ultimate roots in the purposes of God, and it just becomes this commodity that we get caught up in. And then finally, the church form, the parish emerges in the feudal, traditional, pre-modern era. You might say the congregation emerges in the modern era, where there's this greater emphasis on choice, to choose to gather with a congregation that fits your particular doctrinal or creedal preferences. And the form of church in the post or late modern era, well, I'm not sure that we know necessarily what it is. People are experimenting and the form is emerging. And of course, it's not like these different eras sort of happen one after the other. We now live in an age where we can see expressions of all of these different aspects of culture. And from a church point of view, of course, the parish structure still exists. The congregational form is still very much part of our experience, and yet we are also seeing people exploring emerging forms of church. So actually, I hadn't realised these skipped on like this. I'm just going to put the whole thing up actually, because otherwise I forget to do it. So the really interesting thing for me is that in each of these ages, the church, I think, maintained or expressed a kind of posture, a kind of how it sees itself within culture and how it positions itself within culture. And I think in the reading I call these ecclesial imaginaries, again borrowing from Charles Taylor, who refers to social imaginaries. But what I mean by that really is just how we inhabit what it means to be church, almost without realizing it. Almost without questioning it, because that's just the way it has been, and perhaps how we've experienced church all our lives. And these three sets of circles describe my attempt at distilling the ecclesial imaginary, the kind of the way the church has related to the world around it in each of these different ages. So in the pre-modern, which Charles Taylor calls the ancien regime, because he's an academic and you can use language like that. But essentially, the church is the center of the world. It is the gravity. It's the thing around which everything else orbits. Culture and authority and time. Everything is pulled kind of into the orbit of the church, at least in the West. And then in the modern age, Taylor calls this the age of mobilization. And it's in the context of this increasing sacred secular divide, in the sense in which organizations increasingly feel that they have to mobilize themselves to make a difference in the world. And I don't think the church is any different from that. I think the church is very much any different to that. So that there's a sense in which the church still remains very much at the heart of things, but has to sort of engage with the world in a much more assertive way. And so it's an increasing move towards an active posture of the church, where it engages with the world in a very deliberate and sort of often programmatic kind of way. And then Charles Taylor talks about the late modern age as the age of authenticity. So there's this shift towards the individual, and a move towards the whole body of Christ, sort of stepping up as individuals. But I think the key thing for me is recognizing that the church in a secular age is kind of very much peripheral, very much more on the edge of our society than it ever was. And the question, I'll come on to Missio Dei in a minute, but the question is, how can we faithfully be the church for a secular age? What might it mean to connect with our culture, whilst at the same time offering a distinctive witness to the gospel within our culture? And I think this very assertive, sort of mobilized form of church is something that we need to reflect on, as a sort of legacy for the church today. And I think there are two connected things that bring that to attention. And the first of those is the Missio Dei. So the Missio Dei was a theology that was developed through the 20th century. And for me, it was brought to prominence within the Church of England by the publication of Mission Shaped Church in 2004. And it was summarized by this quote in Mission Shaped Church, that Missio Dei represents a theology that says it's not the Church of God that has a mission in the world, but the mission of God that has a church in the world. So it's not the Church of God that has a mission in the world, but the mission of God that has a church in the world. So in other words, it's re-emphasizing the theology that says God is already active and present by his Spirit in the world, and invites the church to participate in that mission, rather than a more modernist approach which seemed to adopt a posture that says the church is the main agent of mission, and so we've got to pull our socks up and roll our sleeves up and get stuck into the world. And that theology, it seems to me, invites a bit more of a peripheral agency for the church in the mission of God. It suggests a much more humble posture of participation in the mission of God that's already happening by his Spirit. And it moves us from kind of this sort of client provider posture that we sometimes, I think, slip into, where the world is in a sense is a client, and we see that demonstrates or expresses certain material or spiritual needs, and it's our job as the church to provide those needs. And the Missio Dei invites us into more of a partnership model that says we partner with the mission of God already present and active in the world, which might show itself in all sorts of unlikely and surprising contexts. So we might actually partner with organizations outside of the church to serve in the building of the kingdom and the mission of God. And so the Missio Dei is one thing that might bring this sort of mobilized, active mode of church to cause us to reflect on that. And the second thing is this whole thing of the experience of acceleration of time, which is, I think, this logical consequence of seeing time as a resource, seeing time as something that is just something to be used rather than something that's created by God. And in our culture, I think busyness almost becomes a moral good, because to be busy is to be active, and an action is a good thing because you're using time to the best of your ability. So to become busy is to be good. And as churches, I think we often engage with that by becoming busy places. And it might be that we're engaging with that and becoming busy places because it's important for us to engage with our culture. But I wonder at what cost sometimes that churches feel the need to become busy places. And theologically, is it justified for us to become such busy places or to be such busy places? So John Swinton, I think in the reading that you got, said, we have become people who think we have to fit God in rather than fit in with what God is doing. So there's a clear connection between our use of time and the Missio Dei. If we're fitting in with God's time, is it right that sometimes we're rushed off our feet doing the activity of the church. And if Missio Dei takes us closer to the truth of the reality of the world that we live in, that God is active and involved in our world, bringing it to the fulfillment of his design for the healing of all things, and that we are invited to join in with that at his pace and according to his rhythms. What does it suggest about our relationship with time?